Welcome to the debate. What if the very tools that we use to teach storytelling, like, the beat sheets, the plot paradigms, the whole three-act formula, what if they are actually killing our stories before they can even draw breath?
Right, and on the flip side, what if throwing out all those structural guardrails in the name of some pure psychological expression just leaves a writer completely drowning in chaos, producing, basically a private dream that an audience cannot possibly penetrate?
Yeah, that is the exact tension we are diving into today. We are exploring a framework that fundamentally completely challenges the modern culture of, well, I'd call it algorithmic storytelling. We're looking at Eric Wayne Key's philosophy from his really sweeping work, The Jungian Writer, Story Before Structure.
Which is a fascinating read, truly.
Oh, it's brilliant. And Key argues that narrative must originate not from an intellectual or, architectural outline, but from the raw, unconscious pressure of the human psyche. So the central question we are debating today is this. Does the Jungian philosophy, which prioritizes the psychological wound, the mask, and the shadow before applying any structural craft, does that liberate a story to find its deepest truth? Or, does it risk replacing rigid formulas with equally restrictive clinical diagnoses?
Exactly.
And I represent the position that a story is fundamentally a psychological event. Listening to the pre-conscious wound and the unmediated image is really the only true way to create narrative art that actually survives its own generation.
Well, and I represent the position that while the Jungian depth that Key describes is undeniably profound, treating structure as strictly secondary, or even framing it as the enemy of authenticity, it just ignores how formal boundaries actually act as a necessary catalyst for psychological revelation. Enforcing a wound engine on every single character could be highly reductive.
Reductive how?
Well, it can turn the mystery of human behavior into a predictable psychiatric case study,
I hear that concern. I really do. But let's look at Key's foundational premise, because it completely upends how almost everyone is taught to write today. His argument is, it's brilliantly simple, really. Story is older than structure.
Well, yes, historically speaking.
Right. Long before human beings had screenwriting gurus or, whiteboards or save the cat methodologies, they told stories around fires. They told stories to give shape to the things that terrified and moved them. Death, the unknown, the mysteries of the mother and the father. Before there were plot diagrams, there were dreams.
Sure, but dreams don't automatically make for a coherent 2-hour film.
But they are the raw material. The problem today is that the modern storytelling instruction industry, it relies far too heavily on the language of machinery. We talk about midpoints, plot mechanics, engines, turning points. Key argues that this leads to what he calls premature structure.
Which is a great phrase, I'll admit.
It is, because it describes this anxiety-driven process where the writer is so terrified of doing it wrong that they kill the living organism of the story. They impose a skeleton onto it before it has any flesh.
Right.
For a story to live, the core must be the character's wound, the specific belief formed from pain. That wound necessitates a mask, like a survival persona, to navigate the social world. And inevitably, that mask creates a shadow, the refused truth. If you do not have those psychological pressures in place first, well, all the structure in the world is just arranging furniture in a dead house.
That is an incredibly romantic view of the writing process. But the practical application of it, it's a nightmare.
I don't think it's a nightmare at all.
I do. Look, I agree completely that stories assembled purely by formula feel hollow. We have all seen the blockbuster movie or read the airport thriller that hits every structural beat perfectly on the exact right page, and yet it leaves us feeling absolutely nothing.
Exactly. It's empty.
It is empty. But I push back hard on Key's borrowing of Carl Jung's assertion that cognition is injurious to immediate experience when it comes to the act of storytelling. Structure does not merely hold the story like a passive bucket.
Then what does it do?
Structure often generates the pressure required to expose the shadow in the first place. My primary concern is that Key's system demanding that writers constantly interrogate the text with, what is the wound and what is the shadow, before they are even allowed to craft a plot. It traps writers in a state of chaotic, formless, active imagination.
But that active imagination is where the truth lives.
Maybe, but it runs the risk of forcing writers to clinically psychoanalyze characters who, quite frankly, simply need to act. Action reveals character just as much as psychology generates action. Structure isn't a straitjacket, it's a particle accelerator. It forces the collisions that create the heat.
Okay, but action only has meaning if it is driven by a genuine psychological reality. Key talks at length about the primacy of the image. The image must arrive before the grammar can serve it. He asks the writer to just trust the strange, unbidden image.
Right, the face at the window.
Yes. Let's say you are writing and an image arrives. A face at a window in the rain. A line of dialogue delivered with unexpected violent force. An old woman dreaming of fire. The conscious, structural mind immediately panics and asks, well, where does this fit in the outline? Does this belong in Act 2? What is the theme?
Because you need to know those things eventually.
Eventually, yes. But Key says, stop. Write until the pressure changes. Do not explain what it means immediately. The emotional truth has to surface naturally from the unconscious. If you force a rational, structural explanation onto it too early, you inflict what he calls the violence of too soon.
I have a real problem with that phrase, the violence of too soon.
Why? It's perfectly descriptive.
Because how exactly does a writer distinguish between a living mystery bubbling up from the unconscious and simple, decorative weirdness?
Well,
I mean, if every strange impulse, every random dream image that pops into a writer's head is treated as a profound, untouchable message from the collective unconscious, the work risks becoming an airless private dream, a cave with paintings no one else can decipher.
But he isn't saying to leave it undecipherable forever?
Key says we must protect mystery without romanticizing confusion. But asking writers to delay structural logic indefinitely is the very definition of romanticizing confusion. If you don't categorize the image, it doesn't serve the narrative, it just stalls it.
Let me stop you right there, because Key explicitly addresses this. He does not advocate for formless sprawl forever. He offers a very specific mechanical test for the image.
Which is?
The writer must ask, does the strange event increase psychological pressure? Does it reveal character? Does it belong to the wound? If it doesn't, then yes, discard it. It is just decorative weirdness. The waking mind, the structural mind, must eventually return to organize the material.
So he does admit structure has a role.
Of course. He's simply warning against asking, what is the midpoint, before the story even breathes. To see how this works mechanically, look at The Wizard of Oz.
Let's break down The Wizard of Oz, because I actually think it proves my point about structure.
Not if you look at the psychological origin. The visible, external structure of The Wizard of Oz is a classic journey, right? Dorothy leaves home, enters a strange world, faces trials, and returns to Kansas.
The hero's journey down to the letter.
Exactly. But Key rightly points out that the deeper psychological movement, the actual engine of the story, is a child's encounter with false authority, hidden resources, and the meaning of home after the trauma of exile. Look at the companions.
The Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion.
Yes. They all carry a lack that isn't actually a lack. And look at the wizard. He is power revealed purely as performance. The journey returns Dorothy to a changed psychological relation with her home. That structure only works, it only resonates through generations, because the psychic pressure was established first.
You think the psychology came before the Yellow Brick Road?
I do. The longing, the fear, the wound of feeling misunderstood and powerless in Kansas, that arrived before the Yellow Brick Road was ever laid down. The psychology dictates the structure.
I see the logic, I really do, but you are looking at it backward. Have you considered that the structure of the hero's journey, which The Wizard of Oz follows perfectly, is itself a manifestation of the collective unconscious?
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning, Key leans heavily on Joseph Campbell, right?
He acknowledges that Campbell provides the visible movement, while Jung provides the invisible pressure. My argument is that applying a mythic structure early isn't imposing a machine on a living thing. It is invoking an ancient psychological pattern to guide a lost writer.
But if the writer doesn't feel the pattern,
The threshold, the ordeal, the return, these are not arbitrary plot beats invented by Hollywood. They endure because they map human development. Therefore, the structure is already psychological. You don't always have to dig in the dirt for the abstract wound first. Sometimes stepping onto the structured path forces the wound to reveal itself. The yellow brick road forces Dorothy to encounter her own projections.
I understand that Campbell's map is rooted in myth. But even Campbell's map is completely useless if the psyche of the specific character is absent.
Well, obviously you need a character.
But Key points out that a writer can have the mythic map and still be completely lost. We see this in 100 failed blockbusters every year. The character crosses the threshold exactly on page 15, but no internal identity is threatened. They descend into the cave on page 60, but nothing forbidden is actually faced.
Right, just going through the motions.
Exactly. The map is present, the structure is flawless, but the story is dead. And that brings us to the core engine Key identifies. This is where we move past the vague, kind of generic idea of character flaws and get to the wound engine.
Okay, let's unpack this wound engine. This is where Key transitions from the traditional craft concept of a character's want to the deeper Jungian wound.
Precisely. Traditional craft focuses relentlessly on what a character wants. They want the promotion, they want the girl, they want to disarm the bomb. But Key asks us to look below the conscious want.
Down to the injury.
Down to the injury. The wound is not merely a sad backstory. It is not just the writer saying, his father left, or she was betrayed by her mentor. The wound is the specific belief produced by an injury. Mechanically, it is a false lens through which the character views the entire world.
So it's a cognitive distortion.
Yes. Because of a specific trauma, the character learned a survival rule like, love must be earned, or if I am seen, I will be destroyed, or power is the only safety. This belief dictates what the character cannot have.
Give me a concrete example of this mechanism in action, because it sounds a bit abstract.
Okay, let's use Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol.
Ah, a story with an incredibly rigid, almost mechanical structure. For 3 ghosts, 3 time periods, a clear ticking clock.
Yes, but structurally, if you only look at his want, Scrooge simply wants to accumulate and protect money. If that's the only engine, he's just a one-dimensional greedy man, you know?
Right, a cartoon villain.
Exactly. But his wound is the deeply embedded psychological belief that wealth is the absolute only reliable substitute for the human warmth that abandoned him in his childhood. When he was left alone at the boarding school, he formed a belief.
That human connection is dangerous?
That human connection is unreliable and causes pain, yes. And that coin is cold, but it never abandons you. The wound organizes his entire life. The gap between his conscious want and his unconscious wound is where the story actually lives.
Okay, but
And the rigid ghost story structure you mentioned, it works precisely because it is a forced descent that makes him see the wound as a wound rather than as an accurate perception of reality. The psychology makes the ghosts terrifying.
Scrooge works, sure, I'll give you Scrooge, but I have a fundamental problem with applying this universally. You cannot apply that specific trauma model to every enduring character across all literature.
Key doesn't say every wound is a childhood trauma in the traditional sense.
But he warns against reducing a character to a bundle of symptoms. Yet his very framework demands we play armchair psychiatrist and ask what childhood injury broke them. What about the unlived life shadow that Key himself mentions when discussing John Frankenheimer's 1966 film Seconds?
Arthur Hamilton. That's a brilliant example.
Yes, let's look at Arthur Hamilton. For the listener who hasn't seen it, Seconds is about a middle-aged, wealthy banker who is approached by a mysterious company that offers to fake his death and give him an entirely new face, a new identity, and a new life as a bohemian artist.
A second chance.
Right. Now, Arthur doesn't have a catastrophic childhood trauma. He wasn't abused. He wasn't cast out of a boarding school like Scrooge. His wound is simply compliance. He is a banker who did everything right, who performed every social duty required of him and reached the end of his life feeling absolutely nothing.
The terror of the unlived life.
Exactly. He has been everywhere in his life and never arrived. So if we force a clinical wound belief onto characters like Arthur, do we risk turning a profound existential crisis into a cheap clinical diagnosis? Arthur's issue is a lack of encounter with the self, not a trauma.
I disagree that it's not a trauma.
And crucially, it is the structure, the literal offer from the company, the sci-fi plot device of getting a new face that forces him to realize the wound exists. He pursues the structure of a new life, and that pursuit forces him to confront his unexamined existence. The plot leads the psychology.
I strongly disagree that Arthur Hamilton breaks the trauma model. Key's framework fully accommodates him. The wound of the unlived life is not just boredom, you know? It is the deeply held belief that compliance equals safety.
But is that a wound?
Yes, that the pre-assembled persona provided by society is sufficient for a human soul. That is a psychological injury. It's a spiritual amputation. Key argues that the wound is structural in the sense that it is present before the story begins.
The locked room metaphor.
Right. The character's psychology is a locked room, and the story is the key turning in the lock. And this framework adapts flawlessly across genres, even when the characters aren't modern psychological subjects. Look at tragedy. Key applies this directly to Shakespeare's Macbeth.
A tragedy defined by a rapid, bloody, structural descent.
Yes, incredibly rapid. In tragedy, Key notes, the wound cannot be integrated by the character, and therefore it destroys them. Macbeth's wound isn't an overt childhood trauma either. His wound is an identity built entirely on service and external validation.
Right, he's just a loyal soldier at the start.
Mechanically, Macbeth has no internal locus of control. He is brave for King Duncan. He is loyal for Scotland. He has no psychological ground beneath the role he plays. So when the witches appear and offer a prophecy, which Key defines beautifully, not as magic, but as external permission for a suppressed shadow desire, the wound is activated.
He collapses internally.
Yes, Macbeth collapses because his virtuous persona had zero self-knowledge to withstand the naming of his own dark ambition. The wound was sitting there, dormant, organizing his entire personality around subservience until the story activated it.
The psychological reading of Macbeth's subservience is sharp. I'll admit that. Key is correct that Macbeth was a good man whose virtue was completely unexamined, but I have to bring us back to the mechanics of the stage.
How so?
Macbeth's descent absolutely requires the action of the witches. It requires the external structure of the prophecy. Macbeth was functioning perfectly well in his subservience until the plot intervened.
But the plot only worked because of the psychology.
Furthermore, the act of pursuing the crown, the bloody mechanics of the plot, the actual murder of Duncan, is what forces Lady Macbeth into her shadow possession. The sleepwalking, the obsessive hand-washing, the madness. The boundaries of the tragic structure provide the friction. You cannot separate the psychological descent from the architectural necessity of the murders. The structure generates the madness.
You can't separate them, sure, but you absolutely must know which one birthed the other. The witches didn't surgically implant the ambition into Macbeth. They simply held up a mirror and gave the ambition permission to speak. The psychology preceded the plot point.
That's a chicken and egg argument.
Not really, because it brings us perfectly to the mechanism of the mask, or the persona, and the shadow that inevitably grows behind it.
Okay, before we go further, let's clearly define these terms for the listener, because mask and shadow can sound very mystical.
Fair enough. Mechanically, Key defines the mask not simply as a lie or a deceit, which is a really common misconception. The mask is a negotiated treaty with society. It is a necessary survival strategy.
It's how we function in public.
Yes. It is the doctor's unflappable calm. It is the teacher's authority. It is the good, reliable daughter. It mediates between the chaotic interior life and the organized external social world. The mask is the lid screwed tightly onto a pressure cooker. It keeps the steam in so you can cook the meal without blowing up the kitchen.
I like that analogy.
But the tragedy of the narrative begins when the mask that once protected the character becomes a prison. when the old solution to surviving childhood becomes the new danger in adulthood.
And whatever the mask suppresses, the steam in your pressure cooker analogy, becomes the shadow. Jung's concept of the shadow is everything the persona has decided it cannot afford to be in public.
Exactly. It's the anger the good daughter isn't allowed to feel. It is the terror the calm doctor isn't allowed to express.
And this is where I find Key's analysis both fascinating and honestly highly problematic for narrative agency. Let's look at the concept of the shadow as an autonomous complex. Key uses Fritz Lang's 1931 masterpiece M to illustrate this.
Hans Becker, the child murderer stalking Berlin.
Yes, Hans Beckert's mask is ordinary to the point of absolute invisibility. He is round-faced, soft-looking. He buys balloons for children from the blind vendor. He is entirely unremarkable. But this ordinary mask hides a deeply dissociated shadow complex.
A terrifying one.
The compulsion to kill is signaled in the film by him uncontrollably whistling Grieg's In the Hall of the Mountain King. It operates autonomously. The psychological horror of M culminates in the famous warehouse trial scene, where the organized criminals of Berlin capture Beckert and put him on trial.
The collective shadow prosecuting the individual shadow. It is a brilliant scene.
It is. But look at Beckert's defense. He screams that he does not choose his compulsion. He experiences his shadow as a literal demonic possession. He says to the criminals essentially, "You choose your crimes. You break the law for money. I cannot help mine. I am chased by myself."
Right.
Key points out that the ego has entirely separated from the shadow. Now, mechanically, if the shadow is an autonomous complex acting entirely outside the ego's control, where does moral agency sit in storytelling?
If a character is truly possessed by their shadow, they are just a passive vessel for psychological weather? Doesn't this absolve the character of the very choices that drive great drama? Structure demands choice. Psychology, in this extreme Jungian sense, seems to erase it.
Hold on, you're conflating two very different things there. Describing the psychological reality of an autonomous complex does not erase narrative agency. It redefines the battlefield.
How does it not erase agency? He literally says he can't help it. Because Key is not using the shadow to absolve characters morally. The children in M are still dead and Beckert is still the monster. The point is to name the psychological reality of the darkness. The shadow isn't always a psychopathic killer, and obeying the shadow is certainly not the goal of the narrative.
So what is the goal?
To see how agency operates within shadow possession, look at how Key analyzes David Fincher's Fight Club.
Ah, the ultimate modern shadow possession story.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of it. The unnamed narrator has a wound of emptiness without cause. He was formed by a consumerist world that offered him an IKEA catalog instead of a soul, a condominium instead of a community.
He's the ultimate compliant consumer.
Right. He builds a mask of total corporate compliance, but he can't sleep. The insomnia is the wound screaming. The pressure cooker is failing. Because he will not consciously acknowledge his rage, his psyche literally splits, and Tyler Durden emerges.
Brad Pitt in a red leather jacket.
Yes, Tyler is the shadow personified. Tyler represents everything the narrator suppressed: vitality, physical appetite, charisma, danger, and violence.
And male audiences famously idolized Tyler. They thought he was the hero of the movie.
Which Key points out is the exact trap of the shadow. Tyler is a shadow possession. At first, it feels like liberation. The underground fight clubs offer genuine physical reality and pain over consumer numbness. But Key points out that the trickster without wisdom eventually becomes the destroyer.
Right, it turns into fascism.
Exactly. Disruption hardens into ideology. Project Mayhem puts men in black uniforms, shaves their heads, and demands unquestioning obedience. The Shadow's liberation becomes a new tyranny, one that is even more violently authoritarian than the corporate world they left behind.
So where does agency come back in?
The mechanical requirement of the story is that the shadow must be integrated, not just unleashed. The ego, the narrator, must recognize his own capacity for violence, take responsibility for it, and then shoot Tyler. He must integrate the shadow's power without obeying its destructive commands. That is the ultimate narrative choice.
I see the logic of the integration, but you are skipping over the structural mechanics required to pull that off.
Let me introduce the anima figure here because she is crucial to the structural complexity of Fight Club, Marla Singer.
The woman who sees through the Tyler persona. Yes. Wait, before we move on, let's actually define the anima for the listener. Mechanically, how is that different from just a love interest?
Well, in Jungian terms, the anima, or animus, is the unconscious feminine or masculine counterpart to the persona, acting as a mediator between the ego and the deep unconscious.
Right. So Marla isn't just a girl the narrator likes. Marla is the only character who interacts with the narrator without the Tyler persona operating successfully. She receives his actual, pathetic distress. She is the anima who sees through the shadow's performance and insists on a different relation to reality.
She forces him to wake up.
Exactly. Now here is my challenge to Key's listen first, shape second mantra. To execute a split psychology story like Fight Club or like Denis Villeneuve's film Enemy with the literal doppelganger, the writer must rely heavily on conscious, rigorous architectural design.
I don't know if I agree with that.
You have to! You cannot simply listen to the unbidden image and accidentally write a perfectly calibrated psychological thriller where the protagonist is suffering from dissociative identity disorder, planting precise, logical clues along the way. That requires an incredibly rigid structural plan from page one. Structure has to be the master.
I see the logic of your argument. I do. But the practical application of that is exactly what leads to gimmicks instead of art. You are conflating the conscious drafting and editing process with the origin of the idea.
Am I?
Yes, Chuck Palahniuk didn't sit down to write Fight Club by outlining a dissociative identity disorder plot twist on a whiteboard. He started with the image of men beating each other up to feel alive. He started with the psychic pressure of consumer emptiness.
But he still had to structure the twist.
Or the structure of the twist was the vessel built later to hold that psychic pressure. Key never says don't use structure. He literally writes, story before structure does not mean story without structure. The vessel is necessary.
Right.
But if Palahniuk had started with a beat sheet for a twist ending, we would have a cheap M. Night Shyamalan knockoff, not a cultural touchstone. The psychic pressure must precede the architecture. And we see this pressure most vividly, most dangerously, when the shadow is not just an internal voice, but is projected outward onto the external world.
Projection. This is where the internal mechanics become the external plot.
Right. Projection is a psychological defense mechanism where a person subconsciously attributes their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or traits onto someone else. Let's look at Paul Schrader's script for Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, Travis Bickle.
A master class in the unreliable narrator.
Travis is a man suffering from the profound withdrawal of belonging. He's a veteran, deeply isolated, entirely unable to connect with human beings. But his mask is that of God's lonely man, a righteous observer. He does not recognize his own crushing loneliness, his own sexual frustration, or his own immense capacity for violence.
Because his mask won't let him.
Exactly. Instead, mechanically, he projects it. He looks out the window of his cab and New York City, the filth, the pimps, the violence. And he doesn't see a city. He sees his own shadow projected at a citywide scale.
The city acts as a movie screen for his own suppressed darkness.
Yes, his disgust at the city's sexual commerce is the shadow of his own unexpressed, twisted desires. His rage at political corruption is the shadow of his trained, unused military violence.
That makes sense.
The absolute brilliance of the Jungian lens here is Key's observation that Travis's projection actually lands on real corruption. Iris, the 12-year-old prostitute, is genuinely being exploited. Sport, the pimp, is genuinely a predator. Because the projection finds a real external target, Travis's shadow possession looks to him, and to the audience, by the way, like moral clarity.
Right, it masquerades as righteousness. It uses the language of the hero to commit murder.
Yes, and the terrifying structural climax is that his descent into violence is ultimately validated by the society. The tabloids call him a hero for killing the pimps. The shadow has struck a perverse bargain with the social order. He expresses the violence society secretly wants expressed, but won't sanction, and so society validates his shadow. It is a profound psychological insight into how violence operates, and the plot is entirely subservient to that psychological mechanism.
It is a profound insight, but I must remind you of the biographical reality of that script. Paul Schrader wrote Taxi Driver from a place of intense personal isolation and depression.
Right, he was living in his car.
He was literally living in his car. He was haunted by his own inability to connect, eating junk food, descending into darkness. He wrote from raw, lived experience, not from a Jungian blueprint. He wasn't sitting there thinking about shadow projection and collective validation. He was bleeding his pain onto the page. To claim this as a victory for a specific psychological framework is revisionist history.
But that is exactly Key's point. Schrader didn't need a textbook on Jung to write it. The Jungian framework doesn't invent the territory, it simply maps it.
Well, the fact that Schrader wrote it purely from his own unmediated psychological wound is definitive proof that the wound generates the story, not an intellectual understanding of plot beats. The psychology is the raw material.
Fair enough. But let's look at how projection functions structurally in a genre that relies entirely on formal rules. Consider Kim Ji-woon's Korean psychological horror film, A Tale of Two Sisters.
Oh, a devastating film.
And deeply Jungian.
Let's look at the mechanics. The protagonist, Soo-mi, projects her unbearable guilt onto her stepmother, Yoon-ju. Soo-mi was present when her younger sister was crushed by a falling wardrobe, and she failed to save her because she was walking away in anger.
She couldn't face what she did.
Exactly. She cannot process the guilt. Mechanically, grief would confirm the death, and confirming the death would confirm her absolute culpability. So her mind constructs an entirely alternative reality as a survival mechanism. She keeps her sister alive in her mind and projects all the monstrosity, all the blame, all the cruelty onto the stepmother.
And importantly, the stepmother actually does carry partial guilt. She saw the sister trapped and walked away too, which is what makes the projection stick. The shadow always needs a hook to hang its coat on.
Right, the shadow finds a partial truth to exploit. But the horror of the film isn't a supernatural ghost. The horror is the human mind constructing a false, labyrinthine reality to survive trauma. The creature crawling under the sink is just the unconscious made visible.
Yes, exactly.
But here's my point. To execute this profound psychological truth, the filmmaker relies entirely on the strict, highly manipulative structural tropes of the horror genre. The jump scares, the withheld information, the claustrophobic framing, the unreliable narrator, the rigid structure of the horror genre is the vessel that makes the psychological revelation land with such concussive force. Without the genre guardrails, it's just a confusing blur of hallucinations.
I agree. The structure delivers the force, but the inevitability of that revelation, the movement toward the truth, is what Key calls the descent. The descent is the story's necessary movement toward the territory the ego has been avoiding, and this is where structure and psychology perfectly align, but psychology still leads. Look at Alan Parker's film Angel Heart.
Ah, the private detective who is investigating his own crimes?
Yes. Let's break down the mechanics of it. Harry Angel is a private investigator hired by a man named Louis Cypher, whose name is wonderfully bluntly symbolic of Lucifer, to find a missing singer named Johnny Favorite.
And Cypher represents the shadow creditor, the devil not as some external red-horned evil, but as the neglected part of the self that holds the debt.
Exactly. Harry sold his soul, abandoned his identity as Johnny Favorite, and constructed a new, safe persona as a low-rent detective. But the shadow creditor always arrives to collect. As Harry investigates, he moves geographically from New York down to New Orleans.
A literal descent.
Yes. New Orleans, in the visual language of the film, acts as the underworld. It's the symbolic register of voodoo, hidden history, heat, blood, and the presence of the dead. It is a spatial, geographical descent that perfectly mirrors the internal psychological one.
The elevator scene.
And at the end, when Harry realizes he is the killer he has been searching for, he is in an elevator, descending endlessly. The literal descent into the basement mirrors the psychological realization that Jung described. You know, that the inner situation not made conscious happens outside his fate.
fate as externalized psychology.
Right. Harry's suppressed identity organized the external events. It produced the murders of the witnesses, created the bloody trail. The structure of the movie is dictated entirely by the psyche's desperate refusal to know itself.
I have to push back there. You say the structure is dictated purely by the psyche. But the descent in Angel Heart is a classic boilerplate noir structural trope.
Is it?
Of course it is. The hard-boiled detective going into the seedy underbelly, finding the systemic corruption, realizing he is implicated in the web. That is a structural tradition that goes all the way back to Sophocles and Oedipus Rex. The king investigates the plague only to find he is the source of the rot. The structure provided the vessel for the psychological truth long before Jung was ever born. It proves that ancient structural shapes, the investigation, the descent into the underworld, are just as primary as the psychological wound. The form existed before Harry Angel's psychology was poured into it.
That analysis works for identifying the trope, but it completely falls apart when you ask why the trope exists in the first place. Oedipus is the perfect example. Why did the Oedipus structure endure for thousands of years? Why did the noir detective structure evolve directly from it?
Because it works dramatically.
Because it accurately maps the human psychological descent. Key would argue that those structural shapes only exist because
if you were a writer listening to this right now, you might be panicking, thinking, are you telling me to throw away my outline? Writers often need the rigid guardrails of genre to coax the shadow out into the light. The boundaries of structure, the ticking clock, the midpoint reversal, they provide the necessary friction that forces the unconscious to reveal itself. Without the deadline of a plot, the psyche can just spin in comfortable narcissistic circles forever.
And I will happily reassert that while craft and structure are essential vessels, they are utterly hollow without the psychic pressure of the wound, the mask, and the shadow. Story is a psychological event first. The image, the dream logic, the raw, unmediated unconscious, they must be allowed to speak before the conscious, anxious mind organizes them into a sterile, predictable outline.
But the outline isn't necessarily sterile.
If you start with the beat sheet, you will build a technically perfect house, but no one will ever live in it.
And I will reassert that the Jungian framework is a brilliant, unparalleled lantern for illuminating character depth. It gives us a profound vocabulary for the darkness, but we must be warned against treating structure as an enemy of authenticity. If Campbell gives us the visible movement and Jung gives us the invisible pressure, as Key himself suggests, then both are equally necessary to move the audience. The river needs its banks, or it's just a swamp.
On that metaphor, we might finally be in complete agreement. Key's philosophy ultimately demands a terrifying vulnerability from the writer. It requires us to face our own shadow, our own unexamined judgments, and our own wounds right there at the desk. The blank page does not need our innocence or our clever outlines. It needs our absolute attention to what hurts.
It forces the writer to step into the murky landscape we talked about at the beginning. You have to leave the clean, well-lit drafting table, put away the index cards, and step into the mud of your own psyche.
Exactly. It isn't an architectural schematic. It's the messy, terrifying biology of growing something alive. We leave you, the listener, to reflect on what unintegrated shadows might be organizing your own favorite stories, or perhaps what unexamined wounds might be organizing your own life. We don't declare a winner today. The ultimate verdict on the primacy of story versus structure remains open to your interpretation. Thank you for joining us.